thank you all for coming. It's good of you to take time out of your weekend to be here. I thought I'd do a quick self-introduction. I'm Steve Saitzyk. I'm Director of Shambhala Art and also Adjunct Professor of Humanities and Sciences at Art Center College of Design in Pasadena. They like to pride themselves on being one of the top art schools in North America. So I thought I would talk about briefly Shambhala Art, what that actually is, and try to describe it. And I get to ask that question a lot, being the director of it, like, what do you do? And I find I often answer it in different ways, often not the same way twice. I thought I'd be a little more formal and use a traditional method in at least Buddhist studies, and that is to talk about the outer, inner, and secret level of the understanding this material. And on the outer level, it's an educational program, a nonprofit educational program designed to integrate meditation with the creative process. So that seems pretty straightforward. On the inner level, it's about seeing things as they are, whatever that means. We have all engaged, at least in a conversation, I think, at some time in our life, where we've had a friend and we say to them, "You're not seeing things as they are." So we have some intuitive notion of what that is, but we're talking about how that applies to the creative process. And on the secret level, it's about seeing clearly, knowing what is, and acting decisively. How can I talk about the secret level? It's not hard, because it doesn't really mean anything until you experience what's being said. And what Shambhala Art is creating that environment or an exercise so that you can own what that means. Because it's not enough just to hear it. I remember asking late His Holiness Khyentse Rinpoche a question. I had learned that the meditation I was given by my teacher, the late Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, was very similar to the description of the last meditation instruction you ever get. And I said that it seems kind of identical. And he said, yes. And I said, well, what's all this stuff in between with the visualizations and frustrations and all this stuff that we have to learn and do? And he says, well, you don't really understand the initial instruction until you go through all of that. So there's no real shortcut, at least in the way that I was taught. One of the things I often find myself explaining to people, sometimes people will say, you're involved in the Shambhala Arts, where they put an S at the end. And so I find myself trying to explain that it's Shambhala Art. And sometimes it's tough because there's a lot of Shambhala things. There's Shambhala this and Shambhala that. What I've come to say is that it has to do with a teaching as opposed to a practice. Where Shambhala Art is a teaching about the creative process. And the Shambhala Arts are basically forms that people associate these teachings with. There's no specific criteria that people use. It's not well defined, but it's basically a discipline, a creative discipline as opposed to a teaching. Well, one of the reasons I bring this up is because once I was told by a senior student, I understand in Shambhala Art that you don't make any art. You don't produce any art at the end of it. And I thought about that for a long moment. And I said, well, that's true. We use maybe some abstract kind of calligraphy or movement or gesture or song or arranging or things that are used in the creative process, but we're not actually trying to produce art. It's, in a sense, too much pressure. So in this particular system, so we're trying to learn what is at the heart of creating itself. And also the viewing process. One of the things that makes us unique is that we also teach how to open up to a viewing process. That's why seeing things as they are is important to us. We also hope at the end of each part, this is a 5-part program, that individuals take home kind of a discovery or a tool in which helps elucidate their own artistic discipline or process. because it's not really about coming to an art program to learn how to paint or sculpt, but to go home and take what you learn and what you experience directly in the program and integrate it into whatever it is that you do. And that's kind of your task, is to find a way to utilize this. One of the essential themes that I thought I would talk about, and hopefully our exercise will elucidate a little bit, is this notion of self-expression. Self-expression in the West is a very valued human trait. But the question is, what self is expressing itself? So I thought I'd just toss that out there for a moment, in case anybody had an idea. What self is it that's expressing itself? Got any ideas? You can be brave.
Well, it might be a committee.
A committee? Art by committee? So that would be committee expressing itself as a committee?
Yeah, or you're in a classroom.
Well, is it who we want to be, aspire to be? Is that the person expressing itself? Or is it the self that is afraid to express itself? I mean, I know what it is because I have notes. So tell me what it is. In science, I'd like to bring in a little bit of science because I have a background in science. I ran a laboratory for a number of years. And so I find fascinating, and I also find neuroscience very helpful because they have several things that arise that are very similar to understanding psychology from a Buddhist perspective. One of the things that they talk about is sense disruptors, which work with habitual patterns, because our habitual patterns are kind of a autopilot for ego. It's a perfect tool for ego. In fact, in some sense, well, we know it because there's a lot of self-referencing and self-dialoguing that goes along with ego. And self-consciousness and self-esteem, it's all about self-respect. And basically what I refer to and others refer to as the big me. And in Buddhism, there's 8 consciousnesses, and the first 6 are basically our sound, taste, smell, sight, hearing, and mind is considered a sense because that's where all the other senses come together and are rationalized into an experience. By the way, and in Buddhism, that's often referred to as a me consciousness, as the 7th consciousness that mediates between your sense perceptions and who you are in terms of your personality and your makeup and your tendencies and patterns and so forth. So it's in the middle. It serves a very important function until it loses its sense of mission. In cognitive science, it's known as the default mode network, which is basically what happens when we are not occupied with a particular task. We fall into this mode where we start thinking about ourselves. I sometimes refer to it as meditating about yourself, or the self meditating about itself. And for the most part, things hum along pretty well, and there's not really a problem until the 7th consciousness starts to want to own the whole scene and the whole organization and all the thought patterns, and it starts losing contact with the senses. It's been said by cognitive scientists that every second we take in about 11 million bits of information, sensory-wise, of which only about 200 ever rise to the level of consciousness. So what happens is only a small amount ever gets into one's mind. From there, we're stuck with a situation whereby the mind then projects for efficiency, so it has its own habitual patterns. It projects itself where it doesn't have something filled in. Cognitive science refers to it as prediction machines, is what our brains are, and that they're uncertainty reducers. Because we experience uncertainty, so it kicks in, it tries to organize what it thinks it should be, and projects it out, and then we believe what we see. So the problems with the 7th consciousness, or the default mode network, is that it's limited. So it only has a limited amount of information that comes in, and the part that really sucks is that it's buggy. Buggy, like a computer. It gets misinformation as well. Because part of its job is to check in, do a reality check from time to time, to see that it hasn't lost its total sense of self. That's part of its job. And when we have a lot of hopes and fears, we run into what we refer to as creative block. That's when you don't have enough check-in with your senses. So part of what we're trying to do with Shambhala Art and meditation, we're trying to get the default mode network or the seventh consciousness to just take a break and relax. When it does relax, what you experience then connects with who you are, and you get to express who you are, rather than who you think you are, hope you are, fear you are, or any of those kinds of self-referencing. So there's an opportunity to have what is we refer to as pure expression. And pure expression really is just that relaxed posture that one has taken. And that pure expression actually is true expression, as it turns out. You really are expressing yourself rather than just your hopes and fears. And the teacher who founded this teaching has a quote that's often used, which is, "There is such a thing as unconditional expression that does not come from self or other. It manifests out of nowhere like mushrooms in a meadow, like hailstones, like thunder showers." So it's possible to have this kind of relationship to your creative process. And in terms of the 5-part program itself, part 1 we call Coming to Your Senses. And that's really about strengthening your connection to your senses by way of meditation. Because if you think about it, what meditation is, at least as we teach it with a Buddhist background, is that you're coming as close to doing absolutely nothing as a human being can do without falling over or falling asleep. So there you naturally become resting in your senses. The second part we call Seeing Things as They Are, which is about discovering the nature of experience. As it turns out, there are components to how we experience. In my book, which this is not really a commercial for, but we thought we'd put it out there, I talk about experience in terms of 2 parts. One is felt sense, and the other is thought sense. We have thoughts about things, and there's the things themselves. And our experience is composed of both of those things. And it's important to be able to distinguish them in terms of communication, which we'll talk more about later after we do our exercise. And then the creative process is the title of part 3. And we discover there's a pattern to things as they are. That things arise out of basically nowhere and begin to take shape and then communicate themselves. And we can actually use that as a tool to further our own personal connection to our creative process. Part 4 is called the power of display. In other words, we can create things and situations and environments that are more powerful than words. Sometimes when I say that, I think of poetry, because it's kind of an exception where you can have the reverse, where words can create and invoke what's called our mirror neurons, which is how we empathize with one another. It can bring up states of mind that are very similar to the inspiration of the poet. They've found that even though we might not personally, physically express it when we have empathy with a situation, that our brains function as if it happened actually to us. And in fact, when you go to a movie and you see a particularly touching moment, that's your mirror neurons when you feel like you want to cry with the character. So we can take advantage of that in the things that we create and evoke powerful moments in individuals. Then the last one is art in everyday life. The notion here is a very powerful sense that as in life there are obstacles and negativity that occur, that things don't work. From a Buddhist point of view, samsara fundamentally does not work. We spend all this time to try to perfect things, not realizing often that there's no hope that it ever will be perfect. It's just the nature of conditioned existence. But it's workable. We learn that we can transform obstacles into stepping stones and negativity into energy that fuels the creative process itself. And there are specific tools that can be used so that if we're working on something and it's not really happening for us, before we toss it out, that we could actually maybe try some things in a sane way rather than just simply in our frustration and exasperation destroy it or give up. That things are fundamentally workable even if you can't achieve perfection. You still have some hope of communicating. Maybe this has provoked some questions we could have before we do our exercise together.
Bring up the point that it's not necessarily about being an artist at all or
Right.
relating to the art world, that so much of this teaching, from my point of view, from what I've learned, is bringing a sense of art into everyday life,
Yes.
as opposed to becoming an artist. That from this point of view, your life can become your art, that you don't have to necessarily be an artist or be involved with the art world. Is that true? Is that your
Oh yeah, basically speaking, people take Shambhala art because they want to be able to go to a museum and just enjoy what they see, or have a meal and set a table that's inspiring and feels welcoming and empowered, just to have a guest over. A student who took Shambhala art said that I said that to the group that you thought you were taking a course about art and ended up with tools to live. So that's basically what it's about. That's why we refer to it as a teaching as opposed to a specific discipline.
I am glad that you brought that point up about you don't have to be an artist, because I think a lot of times that stops a lot of people from
Especially in Shambhala art. It's funny because we always have trouble trying to find the right words to describe ourselves. Because if we say this is an art program, then we lose people like you're talking about. If we say this is for non-artists, then artists think, oh, I don't need this. It's not going to help me. So it's really a challenge. So it's really more by word of mouth that people have an experience and then they realize there's something actually going on here. I won't say who it is, but I taught a few years ago at the retreat center in France, and there were a couple of acharyas there, and one of them came up to me afterward and said, "Oh, we were coming to like an art program, and found out that you actually have real teachings." Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah. So I meant to tell this joke about that refers to this me network or me consciousness when it gets out of control. So this couple is like on a blind date, and the guy talks about himself over and over again. I do this, I do that, I like this, I like that. And then after a while he finally says, well, enough about me. I have a question for you. What do you think of me? So, yeah, it's kind of like that, just relentlessly self-referencing. And we can all use a break from that.